At 6:18 a.m. on the 22nd of March, 1943, Corporal Thomas Briggs crouched beneath the belly of a Spitfire Make the 8th at RAF Base Darwin, listening to the Merlin engine tick as it cooled in the tropical pre-dawn air. The pilot assigned to that aircraft was Flight Lieutenant Owen Cassidy, 26 years old, 9 combat missions, 2 confirmed kills. Japanese intelligence had reported a large fighter sweep inbound from Timor. Somewhere between 20 and 30 Zeros would arrive over Darwin Harbor before 0800 Cassidy would be flying straight into them. Briggs had been working on aircraft engines since he was 15 years old. He had grown up in Bathurst, New South Wales, apprenticed to his uncle's garage at the end of the main street, learning to read engines by sound before he could properly read technical manuals. He had come into the RAF as a fitter because there was nothing else in the world he knew how to do. And by March 1943, after 7 months at Darwin, he knew one thing with absolute certainty that nobody above his rank was willing to hear. The Spitfire's Merlin engine was dying in this heat, not breaking down, not failing in any way that appeared in the official maintenance logs, just slowly, quietly giving up a portion of the performance it had been designed to deliver. And that portion was the difference between a pilot coming home and a pilot going into the Timor Sea. The problem was oil viscosity. It was a problem so basic that Briggs had understood it almost immediately upon arriving at Darwin, and so invisible that it had taken the engineering officers 7 months to refuse to acknowledge it. The Merlin engine had been designed in England. The oil specified in the official maintenance manual, the grades, the change intervals, the operating temperatures, everything had been calculated for an English climate. Southern England in wartime averaged perhaps 12 degrees Celsius on a flying day. Darwin in the wet season averaged 34, sometimes 38 by mid-morning. The oil that flowed correctly through a cold English engine became marginally too thin in tropical heat, not enough to cause catastrophic failure, just enough to reduce the oil film thickness across the bearing surfaces by a fraction, just enough that under maximum continuous power, the engine generated slightly more internal friction than its designers intended. The Merlin could still produce its rated power, but only for shorter periods before temperatures climbed into the warning range. The pilot then had to pull back the throttle to let the engine breathe. In a dogfight over England, pulling back the throttle for 10 seconds was a tactical choice. In a turning fight over Darwin Harbor with a 0 on your tail, it was a death sentence. Briggs had raised this with Flying Officer Richard Holt, the engineering officer, in September 1942. Holt had listened politely and then explained that the oil grades specified in the Rolls-Royce manual were mandatory. They were not guidelines. They were not suggestions. They were the result of exhaustive engineering analysis conducted by some of the finest technical minds in Britain. Holt further explained that Briggs was a corporal who had learned his trade in a garage in the New South Wales interior, and that perhaps he should focus on following the maintenance schedule rather than guessing Rolls-Royce. Briggs said nothing further to Holt. He went back to the flight line and kept listening to engines. The first pilot Briggs lost to the heat was Sergeant Alan Fowler, the 14th of October, 1942. Fowler was from Perth, 22 years old, had the easy confidence of a man who had been good at everything he had tried in his short life. Briggs had done the pre-flight on his aircraft every morning for 3 weeks. They talked about cricket. Fowler thought Bradman was overrated, which Briggs found genuinely offensive, and they argued about it with the particular warmth of 2 men far from home who had nothing else to argue about. On the 14th of October, Fowler intercepted a formation of Zeros at 23,000 feet over the harbor. His flight of 4 got the bounce from altitude exactly as doctrine prescribed. Fowler went after a 0 that was turning hard below him. He pushed the throttle to the firewall, built speed, rolled in. The merge was clean. He got hits on the 0's left wing on the first pass. He came around for another run, stayed at maximum power to hold the speed advantage. His engine temperature gauge climbed into the red in under 90 seconds. He pulled the throttle back. The Spitfire slowed. The 0 he had been pursuing reversed and was suddenly behind him inside his turning radius with a speed advantage. Fowler tried to evade. The 0 stayed with him. His wingman heard him call out the temperature problem on the radio, then heard the guns, then heard nothing. Briggs looked at Fowler's empty bunk that night and understood with complete clarity what had happened. He had signed off that aircraft's maintenance log that morning. The engine was within every specification that mattered to the Royal Australian Air Force. The oil was the correct grade. The change interval was correct. Everything was correct. Alan Fowler was dead anyway. The second pilot was Pilot Officer James Noonan. The 3rd of December 1942. Noonan was older, 28, a former school teacher from Ballarat who had learned to fly at his own expense before the war. He was methodical, careful, a student of the technical manuals in a way most pilots were not. He had come to Briggs in November with a question about oil operating temperatures, had read the manual himself, and noticed the same discrepancy that Briggs had noticed. He asked if there was anything to be done about it. Briggs told him about his conversation with Holt. Noonan nodded slowly, thanked him, and walked away. On the 3rd of December, Noonan was flying top cover for a bomber strike on Timor. A large Zero formation came up to meet them. Noonan's section was bounced from above. He went to maximum power, tried to climb away from the engagement. 3 minutes into the fight, his engine temperatures forced him to reduce throttle. He lost the climb rate. 2 Zeros converged on him from opposite directions. The combat report from his wingman described a Spitfire that appeared to slow suddenly at the critical moment, as though the pilot had made an inexplicable decision to reduce power in the middle of an escape maneuver. The official report listed the cause as pilot error during defensive maneuvering. Briggs read that report 3 times. He then folded it carefully, placed it under his bunk, and lay on his back in the Darwin heat, staring at the corrugated iron ceiling for a very long time. By February 1943, Briggs had watched 9 pilots die. He had worked on most of their aircraft, had heard the same story repeated with minor variations every time. The Merlin would start climbing toward the temperature limit somewhere between 60 and 120 seconds after a pilot went to full power in a hard engagement. The pilot would pull back the throttle to save the engine. The Zero would capitalize on the resulting speed loss. The pilot would die. The maintenance log would show nothing wrong. The engineering officer would write pilot error. Briggs started doing something methodical in his spare time. He began recording oil temperatures at startup, mid, mission, and return for every aircraft he serviced. He borrowed a notebook from the signals section and wrote down every reading in columns: date, aircraft serial number, ambient temperature, oil temperature at various intervals. He did this for 4 months without telling anyone. What the numbers showed was consistent and clear. On days when the ambient temperature was above 32 degrees, every Merlin on the flight line was running 6 to 9 degrees hotter than the manual baseline, operating temperature within 80 seconds of maximum continuous power. Not dangerously hot, just hot enough to force a throttle reduction at exactly the wrong moment in a dogfight. He also did something else. He started experimenting on his own time with 2 oils. The RAF had 2 grades available at Darwin: the standard Merlin specification oil and a slightly higher viscosity oil designated for use in Bristol Hercules radial engines in Beaufighters. The Hercules oil was not approved for Merlin use. The manuals were explicit on this. But in Briggs' notebook calculations, a blend of 70% standard Merlin oil and 30% Hercules oil would produce a viscosity at 38 degrees ambient that closely matched the viscosity of pure standard oil at 12 degrees, which was the temperature the engine had been designed around. He tried the blend in a ground run-up on a written-off Spitfire that was awaiting salvage, ran the engine through a full power sequence, watched the temperature gauges. The oil temperatures peaked lower. The engine sustained maximum power longer before the temperatures climbed into the caution range. He did it 3 more times, same result each time. The problem was that using Hercules oil in a Merlin was a direct violation of the Rolls-Royce Maintenance Manual, a manual that carried the authority of the British Air Ministry behind it. If Briggs modified an aircraft's oil specification without authorization and the engine failed, he would face a court-martial. If the engine failed in flight and the pilot died, the consequences would be worse than a court-martial. But Fowler was dead, and Noonan was dead, and 7 others whose names Briggs had written in the front of his notebook were dead, and tomorrow Flight Lieutenant Owen Cassidy was going to climb into a Spitfire and fly against Zeros, and that Spitfire's Merlin was going to start overheating inside of 2 minutes. At full power, on the evening of the 21st of March, Cassidy came to the maintenance area. He found Briggs cleaning an oil filter at the bench outside the hangar. Cassidy had heard something from a pilot who had transferred from another squadron, a rumor about a ground crew corporal who had figured something out about the engines. He asked Briggs directly if there was anything that could be done about the temperature problem. He said he did not care whether it was in the manual. He said he had watched 3 men in his flight die in the past 2 months, and he was not interested in dying the same way. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. He told Cassidy to come back before dawn. He would see what he could do. Briggs worked alone that night in the maintenance hangar after 2,300 hours. The tropical air was thick and hot. Even at midnight, the generator outside hummed. Insects flew against the work lights in slow orbits. The smell of oil and hydraulic fluid was so familiar to him by now that he barely noticed it. He pulled Cassidy's Spitfire into the hangar on the pretense of checking the undercarriage hydraulics, which gave him a reason to have the aircraft inside with the access panels open. He drained 4 liters of the standard Merlin oil from the engine reservoir. The oil came out dark gold in the work light. He replaced it with 4 liters of Hercules oil from a drum he had quietly set aside 3 weeks earlier, relabeled with a marker pen in case anyone checked. The blend ratio he had calculated was close enough. He ran a ground check of the oil system, watched the pressure gauges, normal readings. He reinstalled all the access panels, checked everything twice, cleaned his hands, walked the aircraft back out to its dispersal point. He was back in the maintenance area by 0115. He did not sleep. He sat on a fuel drum outside the hangar and smoked one of the 3 cigarettes he allowed himself each day and listened to the Darwin night. The insects, the distant harbor water, somewhere far out to sea the low rumble that might have been thunder, or might have been something else. He had just put an unapproved oil blend into a combat aircraft. If the engine seized in flight, Cassidy would die and Briggs would spend years in a military prison. If the engine performed as his calculations predicted, Cassidy might live. There was no version of this where Briggs had not violated the regulations. He had done it anyway. At 0618, he watched Cassidy walk out to the aircraft for pre-flight, watched him climb into the cockpit, watched the Merlin start, heard it settle into its characteristic even idle that Briggs could read like music. At 0641, Cassidy taxied to the runway. At 0645, the Spitfire lifted off the red dirt of Darwin and climbed northwest into the early morning. Briggs stood at the edge of the dispersal area and watched it go. The Japanese formation was picked up on radar at 07:03:27 aircraft, zeros from the 202nd Naval Air Group operating out of Koh Pang. Cassidy's squadron of 8 Spitfires climbed to intercept at 24,000 feet. The morning sun was to the southeast. The Spitfires had height and they had the sun. For once, the setup was perfect. Cassidy was flying number 2 to his section leader, squadron leader Peter Walsh. Walsh called the bounce at 0721. They rolled in. Cassidy picked a 0 at the trailing edge of the Japanese formation. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Merlin opened up. He watched the temperature gauges from habit, the deeply ingrained habit of 7 months watching engines run too hot. He counted seconds in his head. 10 seconds. 20, 30. The temperature was climbing, but slowly climbing in the way it was supposed to climb, rather than the urgent red line rush he had learned to dread. 60 seconds at full power. The gauge was still in the green. He barely noticed. He was already firing. The 0 grew enormous in his windscreen. He pressed the trigger, and the 4 20mm cannons hammered through the airframe. The rounds walked across the 0's wing route. The Japanese pilot broke hard left and dove. Cassidy rolled to follow. The Spitfire snapped into the turn, and he kept the throttle full forward because he could, because the temperature was still inside the limits, because for the first time in his memory the engine was doing what it was supposed to do for as long as he needed it. He stayed with the 0 through the dive. Built speed. The 0 tried to pull out and climb. Cassidy pulled with him, held the throttle open, felt the G's stack up against his body, got the nose ahead of the 0's cockpit, fired. The cannon shells went through the engine cowling. The 0's propeller stopped. The aircraft fell away in a long curving descent toward the sea, trailing a thin line of white smoke. His first kill in 7 weeks, but there was no time to feel it. His radio burst with his wingman. S voice. 4 zeros coming from the north, fast. They had seen Cassidy's C.S attack, and they were coming to answer it. Cassidy looked up and found them, 4 specks growing quickly, diving with the speed advantage. In every previous engagement Cassidy could remember, this was the moment the math stopped working in his favor. He would need full power to climb. Full power meant the temperature gauge climbing toward the red within 90 seconds. He would have to reduce throttle before he had energy or altitude. The zeros would catch him. He went to full power anyway, because tonight the gauge was behaving. He pulled the Spitfire into a steep climbing turn. Maximum power, kept the nose coming up. The Merlin screamed. The temperature climbed, touched the lower edge of the caution band, and held there, did not continue into the red, held. The lead zero had committed to its diving attack angle. It had calculated where Cassidy's Spitfire would be based on the performance it expected from a Merlin running hot. It expected Cassidy to reduce power, to shallow the climb, to begin drifting right to preserve the engine. Cassidy did none of those things. He kept climbing, kept turning, kept the throttle open. The zero overshot. Its pilot had aimed at a Spitfire that was no longer where the Spitfire should have been. Cassidy came over the top of his climbing turn, pushed the nose down, and found the zero directly in front of him at 200 meters, slow and exposed, its pilot looking left and right trying to find where the Spitfire had gone. Cassidy fired once. A short burst, it was enough, 2 kills. The remaining 3 zeros broke off the attack and climbed away to regroup. Cassidy's section had scattered across the sky. He found Walsh's aircraft and reformed. They climbed back toward the main engagement. The entire time the temperature gauge sat in the green. When Cassidy landed at 0849, Briggs was on the flight line. He had been there since 0600. He watched the Spitfire roll out and taxi to the dispersal, watched Cassidy shut down the Merlin, watched the engine tick into silence in the morning heat. Cassidy climbed out. His face was wet with sweat. His hands were not quite steady. He walked to Briggs and said, very quietly, that the engine had not gone hot. Not once. He had kept the throttle open for 4 minutes straight in the engagement, and the temperature had never gone into the red. He said it had felt like flying a different aircraft. He asked Briggs what he had done. Briggs told him about the oil, told him everything. The blend ratio, the calculations, the ground tests on the salvage aircraft, the 4 months of temperature records in his notebook. All of it. Cassidy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if Briggs could do the same modification to the other aircraft in the squadron. What neither of them knew was that Flying Officer Holt had watched Cassidy's engagement from the operations room, tracking the radio calls and the radar returns. He had noticed that Cassidy had maintained maximum power through maneuvers that typically forced Darwin pilots to reduce throttle. He had heard no radio calls about temperature problems from Cassidy's aircraft. He went to the flight line after the debrief specifically to inspect Cassidy's Spitfire. He found Briggs. Holt stood in the Darwin morning sun and listened while Briggs explained the oil blend. Holt's face was difficult to read. He was a precise man who had built his professional identity around the correct application of technical regulations, and what Briggs had done was a clear and documented violation of those regulations. Holt had every authority to initiate disciplinary proceedings immediately. Instead, Holt asked one question. He asked whether Briggs had written documentation of the temperature differential data he had collected over 4 months. Briggs said yes. He retrieved the notebook from his kit and handed it to Holt without a word. Holt stood in the sun and read through 4 months of temperature readings, column after column of dates and serial numbers and figures written in pencil in a neat hand. He read it for a long time. Then he looked up and told Briggs that he was not authorized to modify the oil specification on any aircraft. He further told Briggs that he, Holt, was going to take this notebook and prepare a technical memorandum to headquarters RAF command requesting emergency approval for an operational trial of the modified oil blend. He told Briggs that until that approval was received, no further modifications were to be made. Then he told Briggs that the memorandum would take approximately 48 hours to prepare and transmit, and that he personally would not be conducting any unscheduled oil system inspections during that period. Briggs understood. He modified 7 aircraft that night. Japanese fighter pilots first noticed something had changed in late March 1943. The 202nd Naval Air Group's combat reports from the last week of March noted that Darwin-based Spitfires were sustaining maximum power through maneuvering sequences that had previously caused them to reduce throttle. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Nakamura was one of the more experienced Zero pilots operating from Koepang. He had been flying against Darwin since early 1943 and had developed a precise understanding of the Spitfire's combat rhythm. He knew that a Spitfire at full power in a hard turn would be forced to reduce throttle within 90 to 100 seconds. He had built his tactics around that interval, the way a boxer builds tactics around an opponent's reach. On the 28th of March 1943, Nakamura engaged a Spitfire over the harbor. He drew the engagement out deliberately, using the standard approach. He allowed the Spitfire to commit to an attacking run. He broke hard, forced the turn, waited for the throttle reduction that would slow the Spitfire and give him the angular advantage he needed. The throttle reduction did not come. The Spitfire stayed at full power through 120 seconds of hard maneuvering. Nakamura had to extend, had to dive away, had to break off the engagement at a moment when by all his experience he should have been inside the Spitfire's turn and lining up for a killing burst. He returned to Koepang and filed a report noting that the Spitfire he had engaged appeared to have different engine performance characteristics from previous encounters. His section leader dismissed the report as faulty observation under combat stress. Nakamura filed the same observation again on the 3rd of April. And again on the 9th of April. By mid-April, 3 other pilots in the 202nd had reported similar experiences. The Spitfires at Darwin were sustaining power in ways that contradicted everything the Zero pilots had learned about them. Tactics that had worked with consistent reliability through February and early March were producing unexpected results. An aircraft that should have been slowing was not slowing. A pilot who should have been reaching for the throttle with one hand and the radio with the other was instead reversing and firing. Japanese intelligence examined wreckage from 2 Spitfires that had been shot down in early April. They found nothing unusual. The engines appeared standard. The oil systems appeared standard. Whatever was different about the Darwin Spitfires was not visible in wreckage. What the Japanese could not examine was the maintenance logs, and what the maintenance logs did not record, by the quiet administrative arrangement between Briggs and Holt, was the modified oil blend. On paper, every Spitfire at Darwin was running standard specification oil at standard change intervals. The truth lived only in Briggs' pencil notebook and in the temperature gauges of aircraft that kept their engines in the green through 4 minutes of hard combat. By late the 20th of April 2nd, kill ratio against Darwin had shifted from approximately 2-to-1 in Japan favor to nearly even. Japanese command began requiring numerical superiority of at least 3-to-1 before authorizing interception missions against Darwin. That requirement effectively reduced the frequency and scale of attacks on the port. Darwin's supply operations, critical to Allied movements through the Northern Territory, began to flow more reliably. The modification eventually became semi-official by a process of studied ambiguity. RAF headquarters received Holt's technical memorandum in early April and responded with a communication that was carefully worded to neither approve nor prohibit the modified blend pending formal Rolls-Royce evaluation. Holt filed this response and continued to conduct no unscheduled oil system inspections. By June 1943, 3 other RAF maintenance units in the Northern Territory were using variations of Briggs' blend based on information passed between crew chiefs during the informal conversations that happen whenever mechanics gather to talk about engines. Rolls-Royce Engineering reviewed the Darwin maintenance data in late 1943. Their conclusion was that the specified oil grades for tropical operations required revision. Updated tropical maintenance schedules for Merlin engines were issued in early 1944. The revised documentation made no reference to Darwin or to the 202nd Naval Air Group as suddenly cautious approach to interception or to 4 months of temperature readings in a corporal's pencil notebook. It referenced only engineering analysis and operational evaluation data. Briggs' name appeared nowhere. Cassidy survived the war. He flew 71 combat missions over Darwin and New Guinea, was credited with 9 confirmed kills, and returned to his family's property near Armadale in 1945. He never discussed the oil modification with anyone outside the squadron. When a journalist from a Sydney newspaper came to write about the Darwin air battles in 1947, Cassidy told him that the ground crews were the real reason the pilots survived, and that a corporal named Briggs in particular was the best engine man he had ever seen. The journalist wrote that the ground crews had been dedicated and professional. He did not know enough to ask the follow-up question. Holt remained in the RAF after the war. He became a senior technical officer and was regarded as one of the service's more capable engineering administrators. He had a reputation for being unusually willing to listen to enlisted technical staff. In briefings to junior officers, he occasionally referred to a principle he called the garage rule, which held that the man closest to the engine usually knows something the manual doesn't. He never explained where the principle came from. Briggs returned to Bathurst after his discharge in 1946. He went back to his uncle's garage, eventually bought it, worked there for 38 years. He was a precise and methodical mechanic with an exceptional ability to diagnose engine problems by sound and temperature. His customers said he could tell you what was wrong with an engine before he opened the bonnet. He said that was not especially difficult if you paid attention. In 1988, a historian researching the Darwin Air Campaign tracked Briggs down through RAF veteran records. Briggs was 69 years old, still living in Bathurst. The historian asked him about the oil modification. Briggs confirmed it, said the notebook was still somewhere in his shed if the historian wanted to look at it. He said he did not think of it as anything particularly remarkable. The engines were running hot. There was an obvious solution. He tried it, it worked, and pilots who should have died came home. He said the only part that had ever bothered him was that it took so long to get it acknowledged officially, and that by the time it was acknowledged, the acknowledgement did not seem to include any of the people who had actually done the work. The historian estimated that the modified oil blend, in the months it was used before formal revision of the tropical maintenance schedules, had contributed to improved survival rates equivalent to between 70 and 90 pilot lives across all RAF units that adopted it. Briggs said he had never counted. He remembered Cassidy's hands shaking on the flight line that March morning. He remembered Fowler arguing about cricket. He remembered Noonan asking careful, intelligent questions about oil temperatures and then walking away with the look of a man who had been told there was nothing to be done. He said those were the numbers that mattered to him. Thomas Briggs died in 2001 at age 82. He was buried in Bathurst. His obituary noted his service as an RAF aircraft fitter in the Second World War and his long career as a motor mechanic. It did not mention the oil blend, did not mention Darwin, did not mention that he had spent 4 months recording engine temperatures in a pencil notebook and then broken regulations to act on what the numbers told him. His garage in Bathurst was sold in 2003. The new owners found a notebook wedged behind a shelf in the back storeroom, columns of dates and serial numbers and temperature readings in neat pencil. They could not identify what it was. They threw it away. That is how a war is actually won. Not through the decisions made in operations rooms or the strategies drawn on maps by officers with red pencils. Through a corporal from Bathurst who learned to read engines before he could read technical manuals, who kept a notebook nobody asked him to keep, who mixed oil in ratios that were not in any manual, and who gave pilots the one thing doctrine could not give them: an engine that ran hot enough to keep them alive. If this story matters to you, please take a moment to like this video. Stories like this one live in notebooks that end up in rubbish bins, in obituaries that do not say what they should say, in maintenance logs that record only what was approved. We try to recover what we can. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. We read every comment. Tell us where you are watching from and what brings you to these stories. Thank you for being here.